Welcome back to the program, everybody. George Floyd's death has put racism in policing and systemic racism at the forefront of public attention. Look, it's been going on for years. This has just crystallized the discussion. It's not a new issue in Canada either, whether it's something governments want to admit or not. Indigenous communities have long called for action. But will this movement finally spark long-lasting change, or will it end up, I don't know, another empty political promise? The Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde joins us, sir. I hope you and your loved ones are doing well. I got to begin with the head of the RCMP in Alberta, where, by the way, Chief Adham was on this program yesterday, and he gave us this powerful story, the allegations that he was beaten by RCMP members. Now, the RCMP commission there says there's no systemic racism in the RCMP. What's your response to that statement?
It's totally wrong. He's totally wrong when he says there's no racism, whether it be systemic or overt racism. It's there, it's alive, and it's real. And it's sad that a person in his position of authority would say that there is no racism when it's clear that there is. It's the excessive use of force is there. In fact, Evan, 4 years ago, the RCMP commissioner, former RCMP commissioner Bob Paulson, came to our chiefs in assembly 4 years ago and said very clearly, there is racism within the RCMP. I don't believe it's gone within 4 years. So to have the commissioner from Alberta say there is no racism, he's totally wrong. You don't need to convince First Nations people or anybody in Canada that racism is there. Look at all the studies that have been done. Look at all the inquiries that have been done. Complacency of implementation of the recommendations is killing our people. And it's terrible what happened to Chief Adham. We stand beside him and support him for his calls to justice and a full independent inquiry as to what happened there.
Can you just, I think this is important because I don't think this is quite well understood the way it ought to be. Some leaders say, oh, yes, there is racism in the police force or racism in the RCMP, but it's not systemic racism. What do you say to that?
No, it's both. And the only way to combat systemic racism or racism is by calling it out and acknowledging for what it is. It's there. If you want to combat systemic racism, you need systemic change. And that begins at the very top and it filters down throughout the whole system. And it's very real. Like we don't need to prove that it doesn't exist. You have to just look at all of the studies from the Stonechild Inquiry, the Saskatchewan Justice Inquiry back a few years back, to the Manitoba Justice Inquiry, to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report, to the 231 calls to justice. What's the issue is the lack of implementation of those recommendations. That's the issue. So we have to move beyond these studies now and start moving to all those recommendations. That complacency is killing our people. It's not acceptable.
You're making an incredibly powerful point, National Chief. What do you make of the political response that you've seen, all the protests in Canada? Prime Minister Trudeau took a knee. Given the government's response, for example, on missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls and discrimination, are those gestures important? Are they empty gestures? How do you interpret them?
Well, they're important, but I'd rather start looking at concrete actions in terms of closing the socioeconomic gap that exists between First Nations people and the rest of Canadian society. We need continued investments in housing and water and infrastructure and education and healthcare. The social determinants of health need to be addressed. And so once you start closing that gap, you'll start seeing things start to progress. So yes, those are important symbols to see the leaders of Canada stand up to take a knee and call it out for what it is. But you also need substantive changes in policy and legislation. I've talked about the roadmap to reconciliation in Canada is implemented the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah.
The roadmap to reconciliation is implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The roadmap to reconciliation is reestablishing the National Treaty Commissioner, implementing the treaty relationship with the Crown according to spirit and intent. The roadmap to reconciliation is dealing with the youth suicide crisis and mental health issues, closing that infrastructure gap by 2030. That's, and as well, full implementation of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the National Action Plan. That's reconciliation in action. We have a huge opportunity. We should take advantage of it right now.
I'm not dismissing those things, but one of the conversations that has come up this week that the Prime Minister commented on was the need for body cameras on RCMP officers for more transparency. The data on body cameras is very conflicted. There are arguments that say it does help and it does change police behavior. Others say, in fact, it does nothing and it's just an expensive Band-Aid solution to fundamental problems. Where are you on the use of body cameras?
I think there's an air of transparency that you can look at with the use of body cams, but I think as it relates to First Nations policing, let's get policing seen as an essential service first and foremost. Right now it's a program. We need policing in our community as an essential service to ensure and make sure that there's adequate human and financial resources in place, and making sure that those police services are culturally relevant, First Nations controlled, that it meets the needs of the community at that level. Body cams is one piece. That you can start looking at that. But what about getting more First Nations people on police boards? Right. Getting more First Nations people on civilian advisory boards or oversight boards? Looking at maybe making sure that the response teams are adequately funded. Making sure that there's a lot of things that can be looked at, and I think we have to look at.
What about use of force? What about, you know, the commissioner of the RCMP might say maybe they should ban those things like chokeholds. What do you think? Should those kind of use of force, the neck hold restraint, the chokehold, should they be banned?
I would say, yeah, that should be looked at, because too many of our people are getting hurt and are dying at the hands of people that are supposed to protect us and service our people in a good way. They're sworn to serve and protect all people in Canada, including First Nations people. So that's something that can be looked at. I'd even go further in terms of your recruitment selection process. How do you weed out racists? How do you weed that out? How do you track that? How do you get rid of that in that system? So you can look at recruitment selection processes, you look at better training, better education awareness, more culturally sensitivity. All the above has to be looked at, but start moving as well away from punitive justice to restorative justice initiatives as well. And policing's a part of that, but you have to look at it comprehensively. There's a lot of work to do.
National Chief, there's a lot of work to do and a lot of conversations to be had. I always appreciate hearing from the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Perry Bellegarde. Sir, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity, Eamon.